I really appreciate this direction on the conversation because it's about what information is available to us. So here we are, we're talking about civilian employees, service members, and as we see up here, the contractors. And the idea that when we talk about defense contractors, most people think about Lockheed Martin or Boeing, these giant companies that win these huge contracts to build fighter jets or bombs. But the DoD relies a lot on what are called service contractors. These are contractors like Booz Allen, McKinsey, and CACI, hired to do things like accounting, legal services, consulting. Over the past 2 decades, the Department of Defense has gone from spending about $100 billion a year on service contractors to $205 billion in 2022. And this is the point. It is not quite half of the entire budget that we're spending, but it's sure starting to crowd in on it. Mr. Mosher, you lead the National Security Division for the Congressional Budget Office, and you have decades of experience in budget analysis. We know from public reports that DoD currently employs 2.1 million military personnel and about 770,000 civilian personnel. And I'm going to ask you something I think you answered in your original testimony, but it is important enough here, I want to underscore it. Do we know how many contractors DoD employs?
In a word, no.
No.
We just don't know yet.
We don't know. And I think I heard you in talking about the estimates, that the estimates are from here to here. It's not that we don't know down to the last person. We don't even know what the ballpark is here, I take it from what you said.
That's correct. We don't know what the maximum number is. OMB provides data in their object class analysis that gives the size of the service contracts themselves. One way of cutting it would be about $274 billion in 2022, I believe. But that tells you what the cost of the contract is. It doesn't tell you either the number of the people or how much we're paying in labor. So there will be labor and non-labor costs. One thing that's, there are different types of contracts. There are people who mow lawns, and much of their cost would probably be labor. There are people who sit in chairs, next to civilians and military in the Pentagon. Their costs are probably mostly labor. But there are also service contracts that provide maintenance of tanks and such like that, where you would expect a smaller portion of their cost would be labor, and they're buying parts.
So here we are spending more than $200 billion on service contractors. We don't really know how many people we're hiring or what we're paying these people. And we accepted the GAO estimate of $200 billion. I just want to point out CBO has said it may be closer to $300 billion. The inability of government accountants even to estimate how much we're spending is a sign that Pentagon contracting is badly broken. Now, every time that DoD decides to hire a contractor to perform a service for the department, they are supposed to, by law, be taking that on because it is the cost-effective way to get the job done. Ms. Field, this is right in your wheelhouse. Does DoD collect data that would allow its managers or allow someone doing oversight to conduct a cost comparison to figure out whether or not the department should contract something out or do that work in-house?
No. So it is a source of cost savings, in fact, to insource positions, to convert them from contractor to civilian. The department used to have a database that provided some fairly detailed information about contractors that would potentially help that sort of analysis. Recently, DoD shifted to a federal government-wide database system that has less data.
So we now know less than we used to. We spend more and have less information about it. The Department of Defense's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office found that in some cases, defense contractors can cost 2 or 3 times as much as civilian employees doing exactly the same work. As you say, people sitting side by side. In other cases, they're just outright fraud. In 2014, the Department of Defense Inspector General found that defense contractor Northrop Grumman improperly billed the government more than $100 million for employees to provide training and logistics support for counter-narco-terrorism technology program. Sounds like an important program. Northrop Grumman was charging the government an average of 100 billable hours a day for a single employee. Now, Ms. Field, pretty clearly, nobody can work more than 24 hours in a day, so it's a pretty clear sign that fraud's going on. When you see something like that, right, no one should have any doubt, there's fraud here. Can DoD or DoDIG easily detect these kinds of overcharges or excessive rates?
So I'm not familiar with that particular case, but I can absolutely tell you that it is very hard to detect and to prove fraud. That's why things like hotlines are so valuable for inspectors general and GAO. I will also note very briefly that GAO has recommended some improvements to DoD fraud risk management program. Their guidance department-wide currently does not require routine fraud risk assessments. That's something that should be going on.
Okay, so they don't know how many contractors they employ, and they don't have systems in place that will catch even blatant frauds. Unfortunately, it gets worse from here. When DoD submits its annual budget, it has to include a projection of the long-term cost of its programs so that we know not just what something is going to cost in year one, but what it's going to look like on down the road. Ms. Field, can DoD estimate what its future costs are for service contracts that go beyond this fiscal year?
Not nearly as well as we would like. The department did not used to include services contracting at all in the FIDUP, as you mentioned, the 5-year Future Defense program. That was astounding to us because service contracts represent consistently about half of the department's contracting costs. They have made some improvements in this space, but there are many more they could make. We'll be issuing a report soon with some recommendations.
And I appreciate that. In fact, the GAO has reported that DoD has, quote, limited visibility into DoD's future spending plans. And if DoD can't track this, I don't know how it is that the rest of us are supposed to exercise oversight. So let me ask you one more, Ms. Field. The GAO has put DoD service acquisitions, meaning how DoD manages and makes decisions about hiring outside contractors to perform duties like program analysis or engineering advice, on your high-risk list. That's what you call it, your high-risk list. What does that mean?
The high-risk list is a report we put out every 2 years of the areas of the federal government that are most vulnerable to fraud, waste, and abuse, and/or are in need of significant management. DoD has more areas on the high-risk list than any other agency.
All right, so thank you. I just want to summarize here what you all have just told me. DoD doesn't know how many contractors it hires. DoD can't track whether those contractors will cost more money or less money than having a federal employee do the same job. DoD does not have systems in place to catch even the most blatant frauds when contractors try to cheat the American taxpayer. DoD cannot estimate the long-term costs of hiring contractors, and DoD recognizes that the decisions it makes about service contractors run a high risk, one of the highest risks in government, that the taxpayer is getting cheated. The Department of Defense is not in a position to make smart decisions about how to spend taxpayer dollars if it doesn't have basic data about what things cost. And if Congress doesn't have this information, then we can't exercise appropriate oversight. We should require the Pentagon to put better systems in place to collect these data and then make these data available to you and to us.